Hey everybody, Ben here from Timbra Studios, and I'm back today with another acrylic painting tutorial. Today we're going to be painting stars two different ways. So one of my older tutorials here at Timbra Studios is how to paint stars. Now that video is older, the quality is kind of terrible, and I feel like it could probably use an update. So today we're going to be painting those stars two different ways. One with a flick of the wrist and another with a flick of the brush. One thing I do want to make note for this tutorial though is if you're used to painting on an easel, for painting these stars, at least in these methods, you'll want to paint on a flat surface, otherwise your stars might turn into big drips. But you're going to see a little bit more why that's the case in just a bit, so let's get started. Okay, so for today's tutorial I have painted a piece of thick chipboard with black gesso, as well as gone on top of it with a mixture of some alizarin crimson and some anthraquinone or indigo blue. I mixed it up into a matte gel and put it over top as a glaze to simulate what I might do as for a night sky in a painting. Now the reason why I don't just go straight black for a sky is because the night sky isn't just flat black. It usually has a little bit of a bluish undertone to it. So it's really good to not just use just out of the two black or just black gesso for your night skies. I've also separated it with a piece of masking tape to show you the two different techniques. As always with my big tutorials, lower right hand corner of the screen you're going to see my palette along with some water, my paint, as well as a couple of brushes. Now today's brushes need to be short out of the ferrule and very, very stiff. Now I have this old brush that's been really worn down that I use a lot for when I'm painting stars. One thing you can do is also use a toothbrush, but I tend to find the toothbrushes are a little messier because you're not getting as much control. One thing I did to eventually replace this, because I know it's going to die someday, is I picked up this Simply Simmons brush over at Michael's. It's a relatively cheap brand of brushes. I think this was actually a filbert initially, but as soon as I got it home, I just sliced off those bristles and got it down to a nice little scrubby brush. If you don't have one of these short out of the ferrule stiff bristle scrubby brushes, I recommend either finding one you can buy or making one for yourself like this I did here. And they're really great, especially for glazing, but that's a completely different video for a completely different day. I'm going to use my smaller one because one I'm used to. And we need some white paint, obviously, because we're painting stars. Now you can kind of tint your white a little bit in one direction or another, maybe a little bit red, a little bit blue, or a little bit yellow, if you want to create some more variation in your stars. But I recommend doing that very sparingly, because you definitely see way more white in the sky than you do any of the other colors. Now for this, both of these techniques, I would say that you tend to need a thinner white. Now a lot of times I'm just using a heavy body, or in this case a medium body white, which is very similar to heavy body, and I'm just thinning it down with water before we go in doing the stars. And I'm also going to show you it with some golden high flow today. Nice thin, it's very ink-like, and it's basically already diluted down, so it's a little bit easier to work with. Both work, but one's obviously going to be a little bit easier to work with than the other. Both techniques work, but again, if you happen to have something a little bit thinner, it's just going to save you some time. So the two techniques are simple. A brush technique, and then sort of more my favorite is you just get a lot of water on your fingers and you just flick it down. I'm actually going to show you the flick method first because it's a little bit messier. I actually have some things around my studio table covered up so it doesn't really kind of get splattered and fly everywhere, but it's a lot more fun. Creates a lot more of a random pattern, which is generally more desirable for things that stars that look more natural, that aren't supposed to be specifically the night sky from Earth. If you want something that seems really abstract, really sci-fi, it's definitely the way to go. We'll start things off. I'm not even going to use a knife here, just my finger. We're finger painting today, so I'm just going to a little blob of white. Get my whole hand, my water bucket, and get some water and just start thinning this out and pressing down onto the glass or whatever palette you happen to be working on, just to really kind of push apart the blobs of paint, because the last thing you want are a big splat of thick paint. That won't really look like a star, it'll just look like a big splat. Now, I have used that to my advantage in a few pieces, but not always ideal. Okay, so really you're just looking for super thin, ink-like paint. You just want to sort of wet your fingers like that. And then kind of flick between your four fingers and your thumb. Now you can't do it with just one finger, like that. But it's not as fun that way. I tend to just do a flick, real light. What I love about the flick is that you get stars of all kind of different sizes. The bigger drips are the ones that you had more water on. I kind of go back and just dip a little. That you can almost do like a karate chop. Bigger drips, you also get these lines, which I really, really like. Every now and then you'll get a bigger drip that's more like a splat, though. Those aren't always the best to have, but all you have to do is just let this dry, and then kind of just paint back over top of it with some black or whatever your sky color happened to be. So don't get rid of your sky color by the time you're doing your stars. Here. One thing you can definitely do to make it more realistic, especially if you've been out and seen the night sky away from a city, you'll be able to see the faint sort of glow of the bands of the Milky Way, so you'll get a concentrated batch of stars in one area. I love doing that. Oh, that's a nice Jackson Pollock splat right there. That means that I had way more paint than I had water. This is a little more tricky of a technique to get a hold of, but I really, really like it. Also, that splat, less likely to happen when you're using a thinner paint. When we switch to the high flow in just a minute, you'll see that is basically eliminated. And some of these, especially when you thin with water, you start to get drips that are more transparent. Again, using a thinner paint takes that away. Less watery, the more opaque the paint's going to be, obviously. All right. So that's the drips. Heavy body. I'm going to grab a little of this high flow now. This, I won't even have to dip for water. I'm actually probably only going to stick with one finger as well. This is already very opaque and very liquid. And a drip. Yeah, maybe two fingers. Two fingers and a thumb, just to kind of get a few drips. A lot of them. A few smaller ones at the bottom. Oh. And then my finger touched the board, and then you have that problem. So yeah, it's not a foolproof technique or anything like that, but it is so much fun. I'm going to dip just once with one finger in the water. To get a little more flow here. Alright. So that's the first technique. Finger painting, basically. Super fun. Now we're going to go ahead and take a little more control here. We're going to go ahead and use our brush. So nice stiff brush, again, short out of the ferrule. The reason why I say that is because if you have longer bristles out of the ferrule, you're going to get more of a haphazard splat. The whole point of using a brush is to make sure you can really work in a maybe more concentrated area. So I'm going to get some more white here. Thin it out. Now this is very easy. If you had again, a lot of people use toothbrushes for this. They just flick with their thumb. I like to hold the brush in one hand and flick with my finger. This way I can really kind of be precise on where I'm putting the stars. And then just pulling back the bristles and then releasing. I love doing this for creating that star band in the center. I can really get a good burst. And you get a lot more small, tiny stars and a lot less real big ones doing this. Again, one of the problems with this technique, though, is occasionally you'll get more oblong shapes with your stars. You can come more direct on top. I mean, I am coming at an angle. That probably has a little bit to do with it as well, but now we're going to switch to that high flow. I'm just using the moisture on the brush, not really thinning it, just, what I had in my bucket. Dip, quick rinse. Same deal. Because this is already a little more liquid. I'm pulling back with my arms, as well as really sort of flicking less, because I know very quickly I'm going to do a dip here. We'll do one up in the middle. There's a lot more expressiveness to this. So if you're thinning your paint, maybe the brush would be a better choice. If you're just dipping with your hand, the high flow might be a better choice, but generally speaking. And this definitely creates a more realistic star pattern, especially if you're really kind of careful with where you're flicking things. So that's it. That's the two star techniques. I think both work. Both are very effective. Create very, very different looks. That's for sure. This might be good if you imagine maybe you're doing sort of a point of view perspective piece, especially with like maybe two people laying in the grass. Maybe you want the stars to be a little bit larger in that way. Big open wide landscapes or spacescapes, stuff that I do a lot more often. The flick method might be a little bit more your speed. One thing I do find, however, is that a combination of both actually is very effective. I'm going to go ahead and toss just with a little bit of the high flow in one finger. I'm going to pull just some of these techniques over to here. Just add a couple bigger ones. Maybe some bigger satellite stars and things, and little those big bands in there. Just to bring a little more, maybe some closer stars into that mix. And there you have it. Two different methods for making stars. Two of my favorite. I'm sure there are other methods. One thing I find that's really ineffective is to sit there with a brush and just try and do them individually. A lot of times the stars aren't turning out always perfectly round, and so you try and make them a little, fix them, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden you've got basically a sun in the middle of your piece. Not the best idea. And I tell you what, let's go with one more bonus technique right before we go here. If you saw my video on how to paint easy straight lines, this is going to be a review, but I take an index card or a piece of watercolor paper or whatever, dip it in to get a line I can stamp with. Now let's say this bigger star up in the corner here has a little bit of a glare. 1, 3, 4. Full directional lines, now you got a glare. Big twinkle up in the sky. That'll really draw your viewers' attention in. Makes stuff in your piece stand out. So that's it for today's tutorial. If you learned something, hit that like button, get subscribed if you're not already, consider supporting on Patreon, and this has been from Cinderblock Studios, and I'll see you guys next time. That stuff is, God, it's so much fun. I just love doing that.